In the cold, unforgiving walls of the Tower of London, beneath the leaden skies of February, a 19-year-old girl prepared for death, not with screams, but with silence. Her name was Katherine Howard, Queen of England, if only for a fleeting moment in the turbulent theater of Henry VIII's reign. Alone in the stone chamber that had echoed with the last breath of queens before her, she did something unthinkable for someone so young. She rehearsed how to die. She practiced laying her head upon the block, placing her hands just so, imagining the feel of the cold wood beneath her chin, the blindfold over her eyes, the swing of the blade she would never see coming. Dignity, not fear. That was her final wish, and it was a wish born not out of arrogance, but out of pure, exhausted defiance, in a world where innocence was no shield, and love no sanctuary. Katherine's execution, like so many in Henry's court, was not the end of justice. It was the end of usefulness. And for women like her, usefulness was a currency that expired quickly. Born into the ambitious Howard family around 1523, she was barely more than a child when she was plucked from obscurity and groomed to become a queen, not because she sought power, but because others sought it through her. In the glittering snake pit of Tudor politics, her beauty was a weapon wielded by men who saw her not as a daughter, not as a human being, but as a tool, an offering to soothe the ego of a bloated, aging monarch addicted to control and haunted by his own failures. By the time she met Henry, the king was no longer the golden Renaissance prince he had once been. He was grotesque, foul-tempered, and decaying from the inside out. His leg ulcers oozed and stank. His moods turned vicious without warning. He was a man terrified of mortality and emasculation, desperate to prove he was still the divine patriarch ordained by God, even as his body betrayed him. When Katherine danced into his life, giggling and vibrant, she became his elixir. She didn't have to seduce him. Her very youth seduced his vanity. And the Howards, shrewd and calculating, saw her as their last hope to restore lost influence at court. They thrust her forward like a lamb toward a starving lion, knowing the danger, but counting on the king's obsession to protect her. They were wrong. Their scheme began in the wake of another disaster. Henry's fourth marriage to Anne of Cleves, a political union arranged by Thomas Cromwell, had been a humiliating farce. Henry found Anne physically repulsive, and their marriage unconsummated. The Howard faction, led by the Duke of Norfolk, moved quickly to fill the void. They needed a new queen, one who could reignite the king's pride. Katherine, with her rosy cheeks, musical laughter, and utter inexperience, was their perfect pawn. She was installed in court not as a person, but as a performance. Every gaze she cast, every smile she offered, was scrutinized and orchestrated. Behind her, invisible strings pulled by powerful men tugged her through a role she could never escape, but carried secrets. Before she ever wore the crown, she had lived in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, a place that masqueraded as a finishing school for noble girls, but in truth was little more than a den of negligence where young women were left vulnerable to predatory men. It was there that Katherine formed intimate relationships, naively believing them to be love, one with her music teacher, Henry Mannix, who groomed her under the guise of instruction, another, more serious, with Francis Derham, a man who fancied himself her future husband. These past entanglements, though hardly uncommon in a time when women had no agency over their own bodies, would become her death sentence. When she became queen, these ghosts from her past followed her into the palaces of power, and then fate dealt a crueler twist. While married to Henry, Katherine began a relationship with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber. Was it love? Desperation? Coercion? History is silent on her true feelings. What is certain is that in the eyes of the crown, it was treason. For a queen, fidelity was not just moral, it was political. Any child she might bear would be presumed heir to the throne. If that child was not the king's, the entire lineage of England could be thrown into chaos. Catherine's affair was not just adultery. It was seen as an act of war against the very soul of the monarchy. But her downfall did not come from her lovers. It came from whispers, from those who remembered her past, who saw in her rise an opportunity for revenge or reward. A servant's testimony, a bitter enemy's rumor. Once suspicion seeped into Henry's ears, no truth could save her. The investigation was brutal. Her old confidants were seized, tortured, broken. Francis Derham was disemboweled alive. Thomas Culpeper beheaded. Catherine was stripped of her title, her jewels, her dignity. She was dragged from palace to prison, from queen to condemned, in a matter of weeks. She wrote to the king, pleaded with him, not just for her life, but for understanding. She begged him to remember her as the girl who made him smile, the girl who never meant to be a queen, who only wanted to be loved. The letter was never answered. Henry, ever the hypocrite who himself had committed every betrayal a spouse could imagine, could not bear the sting of being cuckolded. His pride demanded blood, and so it was. On February 13, 1542, Katherine Howard walked barefoot to the scaffold at Tower Green, her skin pale against the frost, her frame shaking, but not with fear. Witnesses said she was composed, even serene. She knelt before the block and spoke her final words. "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." Then she placed her head where she had rehearsed it countless times before. A single stroke of the axe ended her life, but not her story. Because in her death, Katherine Howard became something more than a tragic footnote. She became a mirror to the monstrous system that consumed her. A world where young girls were offered like livestock to ancient kings, where trauma was called scandal, where abuse was labeled ambition, where silence was mistaken for guilt, and truth was whatever the king declared it to be. The England she left behind would remember her as a foolish girl who played at love and lost. But the truth, buried beneath centuries of moral judgment and court propaganda, is far more chilling. She was not a traitor. She was a sacrifice. The axe had fallen, the crowd had dispersed, but the echo of Katherine Howard's final breath lingered in the bitter wind that curled through the stones of the tower. England had witnessed yet another queen discarded like a broken trinket from the swollen hand of Henry VIII, a man whose thirst for domination devoured not just kingdoms and churches, but women, children, friends, and truth itself. To understand the terror of Catherine's execution, one must understand the world that made it inevitable, a world where bloodlines were more sacred than God, and where the king's will was the only law that mattered. Her death was not an anomaly. It was part of a machine, a ruthless, elegant, and terrifying machine that turned the hopes of the innocent into fuel for power and buried the inconvenient under plaques of royal justice. For those who remained alive within the court, the aftermath was not relief, it was dread, because Catherine's fall shattered any illusion that innocence or loyalty could protect you. Fear took root in the minds of courtiers, noblemen, and servants alike, blooming like mold in a dark chamber. Every conversation became a liability, every glance a risk. Men who had toasted with the king one night found themselves in chains by morning. And beneath the surface of feasts and finery, the court had begun to rot. The very walls of Whitehall whispered rumors, like veins pulsing with paranoia. Because if a queen could be erased so easily, who among them was truly safe? Henry VIII, once the embodiment of English pride, now lumbered through his own palace like a decaying monument to lost greatness. His body, once athletic and admired, had grown grotesque, swollen with gluttony, riddled with infection. His ulcerated leg required constant draining, filling rooms with the stench of decay. His moods veered from explosive rage to childlike sentimentality, often in the same breath. With a divine manner, He often treated people as he currently treated them. The conflict he wept over Catherine's betrayal, then ordered the torture of a servant for not revealing it sooner. He prayed for divine guidance, then signed execution warrants with the same hand. Those closest to him, even his children, approached with the caution one gives a rabid beast. Because Henry no longer ruled England with wisdom or justice, he ruled it with fear. And fear, once awakened, does not sleep easily. In the wake of Catherine's death, a strange and haunting transformation began to take place within the public. The people, long accustomed to royal spectacle, grew numb. Executions no longer shocked, they entertained. Heads on spikes became part of the cityscape. The language of treason became commonplace. Children learned it before they learned their prayers. To survive, you learned to look away, to forget. But forgetting came at a cost, because in forgetting the humanity of the dead, you surrendered a piece of your own. Katherine Howard was mourned by no public procession. Her name was not etched into any memorial. She was buried in an unmarked grave beside her cousin, Anne Boleyn. Another queen sacrificed to the same throne. 2 girls, 2 stories, 2 warnings. Their blood stained the same soil. Their ghosts, it is said, still walk those stone corridors, forever whispering the price of being loved by a king. And yet this tale was not unique to England. Across Europe, across centuries, women were used, discarded, silenced, and condemned in the name of power. In the icy halls of Versailles, the daughters of nobility were trained to smile through suffering, to marry men 3 times their age, to produce heirs or die trying. In the dark ritual chambers of medieval Germany, accusations of witchcraft sent thousands of women, often healers, midwives, or simply widows, to be burned alive, drowned, or broken on wheels. In ancient Rome, noble women were poisoned not by enemies but by their own kin if they dared to threaten a political alliance. Katherine Howard's death was not just Tudor, it was eternal. It was the grim inheritance of every woman whose value was measured not by her soul, but by her usefulness to men in power. But it was not only women who suffered in Henry's kingdom of shadows. The same machinery that destroyed queens devoured men too. Friends turned on friends. Brothers betrayed brothers. One word, treason, could erase entire generations. The king's paranoia had become so deep, so uncontrollable, that loyalty itself became suspect. Thomas More, once Henry's beloved advisor, was executed for refusing to endorse his divorce. Thomas Cromwell, architect of the Reformation, was beheaded for arranging a marriage that displeased the king. Even nobles of ancient lineage, men with castles and armies, found themselves kneeling before the axe. No one, no matter how powerful, was immune. The king had become judge, jury, and executioner, and every death he ordered was a reminder. This was not a monarchy. It was a godless theater, and Henry was both playwright and destroyer. In the years that followed, Henry married once more, his 6th wife, Catherine Parr, a widow who outlived him. She played her role carefully, nurturing his children, hiding her Protestant sympathies, surviving by calculation and patience. She knew what had come before her. She knew what was required to avoid the scaffold. Smile, submit, pray, and wait for him to die. When Henry finally passed in 1547, heated and consumed by his own legacy, England did not weep. The air felt different, as if the shadow that had hung over the nation had finally lifted. But the scars he left behind ran deep. Katherine Howard's story had been etched into the national psyche, not as a lesson learned, but as a silent curse. And perhaps that's the darkest truth of all, that history forgets its victims far faster than it forgets its tyrants. Henry is remembered as the king who split from Rome, who redefined monarchy, who sired the legendary Elizabeth. Statues were raised in his image. Cathedrals echo his legacy. But Catherine? No statue, no anthem, only silence. And in that silence, a question lingers. How many stories like hers have vanished into the cold soil of time? How many voices were never heard, never recorded, never grieved? For every Katherine Howard, how many unnamed daughters were sacrificed to dynasties that cared nothing for them? Enough criminality and enough war. People should be learning of everything like this, from voices and the names that matter. History is a mirror, cracked and stained. It shows us the faces of kings and the shadows they cast. It reveals the gilded halls, but hides the screams behind the walls. And if we listen closely, beneath the dates and battles and crowns, we hear something else. We hear the rustle of fabric as a girl kneels, the sharp inhale before a final breath, the thud of a blade ending a life too short. That is Katherine Howard's legacy, not as a foolish girl, not as a treacherous queen, but as a voice history tried to bury. And yet she speaks still. But history does not end with the fall of a queen. It lingers, it festers, it reanimates in the quiet corners where no one dares to look. Katherine Howard may have been swallowed by the blade, but her story did not disappear. It merely sank beneath the surface, waiting. Because the horror of her life wasn't just in how it ended, it was in how many others would follow her path, generation after generation, locked in the same cruel cycles of silence, power, and betrayal. The Tudor court was just one stage in a longer, blood-soaked opera that stretched far beyond England, beyond crowns and castles, beyond the shallow myths we're taught to believe. Consider the mechanics of this machine. Katherine's fate was sealed not only by her secrets, but by the unrelenting eyes of a system built to control the female body, to weaponize virtue, to execute desire. In that world, virginity was currency, marriage was warfare, and the womb was a throne room or a gallows. There was no in-between. A woman's value was measured by what she could produce and what she could conceal. It didn't matter how young she was or whether she understood the rules, only that she played her part without complaint. But Katherine, even unknowingly, broke that unspoken contract. She remembered too much of who she had been before the crown, and in doing so, she shattered the illusion. That was her true crime. Because the truth is, Katherine was never truly allowed to be a person, not in the eyes of the court, not in the eyes of history. She was a symbol, a temptation, a scapegoat, a morality tale whispered to young, noble girls as a warning. Smile, obey, forget. And while her body lay buried in the frozen ground beside Anne Boleyn, her story lived on in the private conversations of women who understood the unspoken message. Don't be seen, don't be heard, and never, ever be remembered for the wrong reasons. The horror wasn't only in the executions, it was in the silence that followed, the erasure, the way the crown moved on like nothing had happened, like Katherine had never been real. And yet her echoes refused to vanish, because Katherine's life unveiled something deeply unsettling about the human condition, about how civilizations justify cruelty, how power eats its own. We like to think of history as a sequence of progress, of kings and queens replaced by parliaments and presidents, of justice growing stronger over time. But the mechanisms that killed Katherine, they still exist. Different costumes, same play. In every whispered scandal that ruins a woman's reputation, in every legal system that doubts victims and protects predators, in every society that punishes a girl for being too much, too free, too loud, too curious, you'll find the ghost of Katherine Howard staring through the veil. Even her trial, if it can be called that, was a farce. She was never given a courtroom, never offered a defense. Her fate was decided by men who barely knew her, some of whom had conspired to elevate her only months before. Their loyalty shifted with the wind, their hands always clean, even as their tongues dripped with betrayal. Catherine's confession was coerced, her choices twisted into weapons, and as she awaited death, those same men arranged banquets, plotted alliances, toasted their own survival. The cruelty wasn't just institutional, it was casual, cold, administrative. That's what makes it so chilling. Because the worst evil doesn't come with fire and fury, it comes with paperwork, protocol, procedure. It comes in the name of order. And in the centuries that followed, England would forget her name. Schools would skim past her chapter. Plays would caricature her as vain, promiscuous, stupid, as if those traits justified what was done to her, as if the sin of being young and desired could ever be balanced by a blade. But the deeper you look, the more disturbing it becomes. Katherine wasn't naive. She was never allowed to be. She was a teenager navigating a world of predators in powdered wigs and velvet coats, a child cast into a lion's den and told to curtsy. And when she broke, when she loved the wrong man or trusted the wrong friend, she wasn't comforted, she was condemned. And Henry? He continued his reign as if nothing had happened. Another queen discarded, another chapter closed. But something in him broke that winter. Witnesses say he grew darker, more withdrawn. He haunted his palaces like a dying god, muttering prayers, haunted by phantoms only he could see. Some say he regretted what he did to Katherine. Others say he never thought of her again. But the truth is this: even kings are not immune to the ghosts they create. And when Henry died in 1547, alone, obese, and half-mad, it was not triumph that marked his final days, but silence. The same silence he had imposed on so many. And perhaps that was his punishment. Not hellfire, not damnation, but the eternal, echoing absence of those he destroyed. And what of us, standing here centuries later, staring back into the abyss of Tudor England? Why does Katherine's story still unsettle us? Why does her voice, lost to time, still scream through the corridors of history? Because, deep down, we recognize the pattern. We see the same shadows in our own world. Different actors, same cruelty. The theater of control has merely changed costumes. We tell ourselves we're better now, more enlightened. But the structures, the hierarchies, the silences, the punishments, they persist. And so Katherine remains, not just a figure of history, but a haunting. Her story isn't over. It never was. Because every time a girl is taught to be silent, to be small, to fear the consequences of her truth, Katherine dies again. And every time someone dares to tell her story, to look past the lies, to mourn her not as a queen but as a human being, young, terrified, radiant, she is resurrected. Not in flesh, but in memory. And maybe that is the final rebellion. To remember what power tried to erase. To whisper her name in a world that once demanded silence. To see her not as a lesson, but as a life that mattered, a life that ended too soon, a life that still, somehow, speaks.